Hi, my name's Bobby Wolf. I work in the IBM Garage, and today I'm going to walk you through a process to help you configure an account in IBM Cloud so that you can control who can do what. And we're going to do that using a feature in IBM Cloud called Identity and Access Management, IAM. This procedure is documented in our developer guide for the IBM Garage Cloud-Native Toolkit. That guide is available at cloudnativetoolkit.dev. So let's go take a look at that. Here is the title page for the developer guide. In here we have a page on resource access management, which contains an overview of kind of how identity and access management works, and also some best practices for how to use it well. And there's a previous video here that shows you how to, that walks you through the process of understanding IAM and understanding best practices for using it. And if we go through all of that, what we end up at the end is this is the kind of environment that we want to set up. So the documentation for that is in the administrator guide section. We're going to look at two pages: plan installation and configure account. So going back to plan installation, we have four different kinds of users that or roles that we need to work with. We have account owners. The account owner is the one who owns the account. Account managers, those are some folks that we're going to set up to be able to manage the account so that the account owner doesn't have to. We're just going to set up one of them today, the one that does IAM. Then they're going to set up groups for environment administrators and environment users. Environment administrators create the environments and are able to create resources. Environment users can't create resources. They can only use the resources that it already has. So we'll see how all of that works. And the environment that we're going to set up, again, here's that same picture, and here's a larger view of the picture. So what we're going to do is, as the account owner, I'm going to set up this account manager access group. And then I'm going to use, as a member of that access group, I'm going to set up an admin access group and a user access group. And the whole account only needs one of these account manager access groups, at least for IAM. But then each environment needs an admin and a user access group. So here we have two environments that are in two different resource groups. And so therefore you need two pairs of access groups for admin and user, one for each resource group. So we're going to do one of these. To do that, I'm going to use two browsers. This is my Chrome browser, and I'm logged in as my own user, which is kind of a super user in this account, and I'm going to act as account owner. And then here's my Firefox browser, and I'm going to use this to log in as the other users to do various steps in the process and to show you basically how they really do work. So going back here, going to the guide, it says, all right, the first thing we're going to do is set up a group for the account managers. And this is a procedure that is performed by the account owner. You need those kinds of permissions to be able to do this. So the first thing you do is you clone our Git repository to get some scripts that we're going to use. I've already done that, so I can skip that step. Then what I'm going to do is set up a group for the account managers, and this explains you're actually probably ultimately going to want several different groups for the account managers. Here I'm just going to do one, which is for the people who manage IAM. So we're going to create an access group with this name. To do that, from the IBM Cloud console, we make sure that we're in the right account that we want to configure, and we go to Manage Access IAM. And from that section, we're going to go to Access Groups, and then we're going to say that we want to create an access group. So here's the name that we want to use, and this is going to be for the IAM administrators for the account. So we go ahead and create that. Now you notice that we have a new access group, but that it has no users and it has no access policies. It's empty because we just created it. So back to the directions, what it says now is that we need to run one of the scripts that we provide. This one is called ACP MGR. So I'm going to go over here to Shell, where I can log into the IBM Cloud CLI. I already have my login command here, which saves me some typing. So let's log into the CLI. Once I've done that, then I'm going to want to run this script here, ACP Manager. I'm already in the scripts directory, so I can just say ACP Manager. I'm going to run it without any parameters, and that way it tells me what parameters it needs, and this one is pretty darn simple. It just needs the name of the access group. So let's go get the name of the access group. This is the one we just created, and we're going to run the command with that name, and what it's going to do is it's going to create a set of policies. So it just created one for resource groups, one for user management, one for IAM. Now it's creating kind of ones for actual resources, so the container registry, the Kubernetes service, and basically all the other backend services. So it created 6 policies total. So we go back here and refresh this page, and what we're going to see is that there's now some access policies here in this access group. We'll let it load, and we're going to see those 6 that I talked about. So the script has just saved us the trouble of creating all these, and it's made it pretty easy to do that. So now we have this group. So now the next thing that we need to do is, as the directions say, is we then need to, whoever your account managers are, you want to add them to the group. In a real account, you would probably have up to like 3 to 5 users, maybe more, because that way they can provide 24/7 coverage. Here, for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to add 1 user, and that is going to be this one here. So let me select that and say we're going to add it to the group. All right, and so this is another user that I have that has access to this account, and he is now a member of this group, which means of this access group. That means that he will have all of these access policies, which are the policies that he's going to need to be able to manage IAM and set up the rest of this as we go along. So back to the directions again. This is some explanation of what's going on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set up a functional ID. And the reason for this functional ID is he's going to own the infrastructure permissions that are necessary for the Kubernetes service to be able to create clusters. So to create a Kubernetes cluster, you actually need infrastructure access to be able to create virtual servers for the nodes to run in and that sort of thing. So to do that, we're going to need a functional ID that is already that we add to the account. I've already done that. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this script here, ACP IaaS, and that's going to set up that user. So the user that we want, we'll go look at him. We'll go over here and again, and we'll get my functional ID. And what we'll see here is that this user is pretty doggone empty right now. That the only access group he's in is the public one. He has no access policies, and more importantly, he has no access to the infrastructure. So let's set that up to make that work. So we need to run that script, which is ACP IaaS. And let's just see what parameters it requires, and it only needs 1 parameter, and that is the email of the user that we want to add these permissions to. So we'll go look at the details of this guy, and we'll find what his email is, which is really his user ID. So technically what it's looking for here is the user ID, but by convention that tends to be the same as the email address. So now we'll run that. And what we're going to see is that it's going to set up 3 policies that Kubernetes service needs to be able to create clusters. It needs access to the container registry, because that's where images come from. It needs access to the Kubernetes service itself. That's pretty obvious. And it needs access to resource groups, because as we'll see, resource groups are where clusters end up getting created. So now what it's doing is it's adding a whole bunch of permissions that are defined in what IBM calls classic infrastructure. So I'll go over here to policies and we'll refresh this page. And what we're going to see is that it now has 3 access policies that are used for creating clusters. So once that loads, we see we got access to the Kubernetes service, to the registry, and to the resource groups. And the whole point of this user existing is so that his whole job in the world is to have all the permissions that are needed for IKS to create clusters, to never lose those permissions, and to never leave the group. So this way, what he's going to do, as we'll see, is he'll own some keys that IKS uses to be able to create clusters. And his whole job is to own those keys and to make sure those keys have the right permissions. So we can see my script completed, and it's added a whole bunch of permissions to this user. So we go over here, and we see that sure enough, there's 4 out of 12, 4 out of 16, a bunch of these have been added. And so these are the permissions that are going to be needed to be able to create a cluster. So now, going back to our instructions again, this explains kind of what all you just did, including why you need all these permissions and that sort of stuff. Then what we need to do is create API keys for the functional ID. So what we would do is we would, in the browser here, we would log in as the functional ID. So you need to know his username and password. And in there, you would create API keys. And you do that, you create 1 key for each member of the access group that we set up that is for the account managers for IAM. So for however many people you have in there, you're going to create a different functional ID or a different API key for the functional ID for that account manager. And then as the account owner, your job is to, having created that API key, 1 for each account manager, you then need to transfer that key to that account manager. So it's a file that you save on your computer, and so you send it to them via secure email, encrypted email, or something like that. I've already done that because it's a little bit of a process, but I've already set that up, and so we have that taken care of. So this takes care of what the account owner needs to do. The whole point here is for the account owner to set up a group of account managers and a functional ID for owning keys so that they can take care of the account from now on, so that hopefully the account manager really isn't needed anymore. So having completed that for what the account owner needs to do, I'm going to go to configure account. And this is the stuff that the account manager needs to do. So I'm going to do that with a combination of the browser and the command line. So one thing that we need to do is upgrade the image registry. So I'll go ahead and show that. It's really not too terribly exciting. It's one command that you need to run. But let's see. Let me log out as this user, and let me log in as my account manager. So once that person is logged in, we can then upgrade the registry. So here is the command for doing that. I just copied it out of the directions. It says, do you really want to pay for this? And you say, yes, I'd happily like to pay for this. And so then what we can even see is that we can confirm that this has actually been done. So we go look at the plan, and we see that indeed this is the standard pricing plan. So that's good. The reason for setting it up to standard is to make sure that we have extra capacity in the registry for all the images that we're eventually going to be putting in there. Again, to run the scripts, you're going to need to clone our GitHub repo. If you've already done it in the previous step, you don't need to do it again. It's the same repo, but just make sure you've got that available. I've already done it, so we have that. You then need to choose a region, a data center that you're going to put this cluster in, and that these users are going to use. So a region, we have 6 of them around the world in IBM Cloud, and then each one has 3 zones. So the one that we're going to use, the region is going to be US East, and the zone is going to be WDC 04. So you'll see that come up later. You need to make sure that that zone has a pair of VLANs, public-private VLANs, because a cluster has 2 networks in it, public and private, and so those VLANs are going to be used for the cluster is going to use those VLANs for its network. Those are already set up, so you don't have to worry about. So in this case, I've already set those up. I've made sure they're set up, so we don't need to worry about that right now. So now the next thing, the IAM kind of part of what we need to do is we need to set up a resource group. So I'm going to set up a resource group called IAM Demo, and for the fun of it, I'm going to put AAA in the beginning, not because that's a really great name, but because that just makes it go to the front of the list, which is easier. What we're going to do is log in as the account manager, which is this user here that I already had set up, but that I just added to the access group. When he logs in, this is the first time that I've logged in, so he's in his own account. What we want to do is switch to the account that we're managing, which is this one here. So always remember that step to be sure that you're in the right account, otherwise it's confusing. And what we see is that there's already a whole bunch of resources in this account and a bunch of other stuff, and that's fine, but we're putting in some more for this demo. So we're going to create a resource group that has this name. So to do that, we go to Manage and Account, and then here we go to Resource Groups, and we see that we've already got a whole bunch of resource groups that we've created, but we're going to create another one, and that is going to be called IAM Demo with the AAA in front of it. And I'm going to go ahead and record this unique ID for the one that we just created, because we're going to need that later, and so this may be a convenient way of getting it. So then what we're going to do is, going back to the directions, what we see is that we have created the resource group. So now what we need to do is set up the API key that Kubernetes is going to use to be able to do this. To do that, we need to log into the CLI, and we need to do it as the functional ID using the key that was set up for this account manager. So right now I'm acting as the account manager, but I'm logging into the CLI as the functional ID so that it'll end up owning the key that we're going to set up. But I'm doing so using the API key that the account owner gave me for logging in as this functional ID. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is log in as the functional ID. Here is the command for doing that, and I'm going to run that. This is logging me into the IBM Cloud CLI as the functional ID. Even though I'm the account manager, I can log in as a functional ID because I have this API key that the account owner set up for me and gave me so that I can log in like this. Having logged in like this, I am now going to run this command. So here's the command, and the region that we're using is called US East. And what it's going to do is ask me, do I really want to reset this key? And I'm going to say yes, but before I hit return, let's go take a look here at what's going on. Again, this is my kind of super user thing where I can see everything. So I'm going to go to API keys, and I'm going to go get the unique ID for this resource group. And here I'm going to look at all the keys that we have defined already so far, and we have a lot of them. And that's okay. We're going to ignore all of those, but we have them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for all the keys that have this resource group's unique ID. And what we find is none of them. We're going to create one here that is called containers Kubernetes key, but we're going to do that for the resource group that we're using. So we say, yes, we want to reset the API key. So it does that. So we refresh this. This is, again, the list of all API keys. We go to that. We say that we want to see all of the items. And again, we're going to search for this, and here we go. We'll notice that we've got a new key here. It's for this resource group. It's for the correct region. They're always called, it's always called Kubernetes, containers Kubernetes key, and it's owned by this functional ID. Again, remember, the whole point of the functional ID is to own these keys and to have the permissions necessary for creating clusters. So now we've done that part. So moving right along, we're going to create an access group for the environment administrators. And by convention, we always call it -admin. That just makes it easier to find later. So as the account manager, remember this page is all account manager stuff. We've already created the resource group. So now to create access group, remember we go to Manage Access IAM. And then when that page comes up, we're going to go to Access Groups. And then we're going to say that we want to create a group. And the name of that group is going to be the name of our resource group, which is AAA IAM Demo. And then we're going to call this admin. And because these are the administrators of the AAA IAM Demo resources. Administrators of the IAM demo resources. So we create that. And again, what we end up with is an empty access group. It has no users and it has no access policies. Now, going back to our directions, it says that to populate that, we want to run this script, which is called ACP admin. So going over here, we need to log in as the account manager. So let me, right now I'm logged in as the functional ID. So let me log out of that. Technically logging out isn't required, but just to kind of show you that what's going on, that we really are doing this. So now what I'm doing is I am logging in as my account manager user. And then we're going to run this script called ACP admin. And that is ACP admin, and with no parameters, we'll see what parameters are required. So what we see is that you need to specify the access group and you need to specify the resource group. So going back to that again, we're going to go to, here is the access group that we're setting up. And then we also need the name of the resource group, which is IAM Demo. All right, so now we're going to run this script. And what we're going to find is that it's going to put a bunch of policies in there for us. So that one is for accessing the container registry. This one is for accessing the Kubernetes service. This one is for accessing resources within our resource group, and this is for being able to access the resource group itself. And we're giving it fairly broad permissions on all of these, that we're making them editor and administrator, which are pretty high level permissions. Gives this administrator the ability to do a lot of stuff. So whereas before there were no access policies, now if we reload the page, we go and look, and what we find is that there are now 4 access policies, just like we saw get created there. So these are the policies that are going to allow these administrators to be able to create an environment, create clusters, create service instances, and otherwise set up and maintain the environment. So they can create the environment, delete the environment, change it all around. That's what these permissions are providing. Then with that, what we need to do is add some environment administrators, but I'm going to hold off on that right now, and we'll demo that a little bit later. So then what we need to do is set up the access group for the environment users, and that one is called -user. So here I'm going to copy the same name that we are using before, go back to access groups. Again, I am the account manager right now, and as part of managing the account, I'm setting up these access groups for an environment. So we're going to call it user, and these are the users of the demo resources. So we create that. As you might imagine, again, there are no users, and again, there are no access policies. Now that we've created the user access group, the directions say to run the script that is called ACP user. So here, as the account manager, I'm running the ACP user script. Let's see what parameters it requires. It needs the access group, the resource group, and the region. So we're going to run that command with the name of the access group that we just created. We need the name of the resource group. And we need the name of the region, which is US East. And now when we run the command, what we're going to see is that it's going to set up 4 policies. It's going to add 4 policies to our access group. So the first one is for the container registry. The second one is for the Kubernetes service. The third one is for the resources in the resource group, and the fourth one is for the resource group itself. So what that does is that gives us access to the cluster, to the container registry, and to all the services in the resource group. So the user can't change that stuff around, but the user is able to, once the administrator sets all that up, then the user is able to access all that stuff. So before we didn't have any policies, we ran the script, and now what we see is that it has the policies. It has the 4 ones that we talked about. So at this point, we've basically finished setting up, the account manager has finished setting up the 2 access groups for admins and for users. So we have those here. These are the 2 that we just set up for the admins and for the users. So at this point, we're basically done with the process. So to show you what we have set up with these access groups, I'm going to log in as this other test user that I have. And right now, I have not added him to any access groups yet. And so we're going to see how this works as we add him to different access groups, what he's able to do. So when we log in, we need to be sure to switch to the right account. When we're in that account, then what we see is that this is being treated as a new user because he's basically not a member of much of anything. So he pretty much has no permissions. And to kind of prove that out, I'll go to the resource list. And here in the resource list, what we're going to see is that he has access to 0 resources. And even more importantly, he doesn't even have access to any resource groups. Classic infrastructure is a special one. This user really can't do much of anything right now. He really doesn't have the ability to do anything. So what I'm going to do is add him to the user group first, just to show what kind of permissions you have there. So let me go find that user and add that user to this group. And now what we find is that this user is now a member of the user group. And so back in his browser, if we reload the resource list, still doesn't have access to any resources because we haven't created any resources yet. But nice thing now is he now has access to our resource group that we set up, the IAM demo resource group. So that's progress. He's got that. Now, the thing that he might want to do is create a cluster. We don't want users to be able to create clusters because clusters cost money, and it's kind of an architectural decision, and so we want the administrators to handle that. We don't want the users doing that. This shows the list of all the clusters that this user has access to, which is none, but it offers to let you create a cluster. So let's go create a cluster. At least we're going to attempt to. What you're going to see is that it doesn't work. So we're using the Kubernetes service in IBM Cloud, which creates clusters for us, creates Kubernetes clusters, makes it very easy to do. We're going to create a Kubernetes one instead of OpenShift. We're going to do it on classic infrastructure. We're going to do a single zone cluster. Multi-zone clusters are basically for production. I'm going to show you something real quick. You'll notice that I've chosen Dallas, which is actually US South, which is not the one we're using. It already has a couple of VLANs, so that's good. What we're going to do is name the cluster IAM demo cluster. By convention, we tend to name them after the resource group. You don't have to, but that's convenient. Helps you find them again. We're going to choose the smallest node size that you can, because that's just easier. And let me broaden this out a little bit. And then what I want to show you down here is the infrastructure permission checker barfs. It says, holy cow, you do not have the infrastructure permissions you need to create a cluster. Well, that's true, because we haven't set that up for US South. What we've set it up for is US East, which is Washington, D.C. So we're going to choose one of its data centers. Namely, we're going to choose the one called 04. Again, it already has a couple of VLANs, so that's good. We've got the same setup here. We're going to make really small nodes because we just don't need to spend a lot of time. But now the infrastructure permissions checker passes, because if you remember, we use that functional ID to set up a key to allow IKS to create clusters. And when we did, it allows it to create clusters in this resource group and in this region where Washington, D.C. is part of that region. It is the Washington, D.C. region. So now the infrastructure permissions checker is happy that IKS has the ability to create infrastructure resources as part of creating a cluster. Now the question is, does this user have permission to create a cluster? Well, let's find out. So what we get is an error that says unable to create cluster, that you do not have the right permissions. So what we've proven here is that this user is being prevented from creating a cluster. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to take him out of this group that he's in. Let's go here, and he's in user, and then public access is just the default. I'm going to take him out of user, and I'm going to add him to our admin group that we created earlier. So let's put him in there. So now our user is a member of the admin group. Now I'm going to go back to the browser. The user's already logged in. I haven't changed anything. Here's the command, the screen for creating a cluster. It's filled in exactly the same way that it was before. But now the user's permissions have changed. Let's press create again. And what we're going to find is that it actually starts creating a cluster. By the way, something interesting to see here is that it gives you an estimate of what it costs to create this cluster and how much it's going to cost you per month. So now what it's doing is it's actually creating the cluster, and you can actually see how far it's gotten, which so far, not very far. It's going to take about 15 minutes. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but you see that there's 3 nodes pending, and none of them have been created yet. That's because right now what it's actually doing is creating the master node, and then it's going to go create the worker nodes. Here's where you can see the 3 worker nodes. You see that the whole thing is pending. And we're going to go back to the resource list, and what we see there is that before this user had no resources. Now what we're going to see is that this user has access to one resource, which is this cluster, which is being deployed. And the reason they have access to it is because it's in this particular resource group. Now let's remember, there's actually a lot of other stuff that is in this account. So going back to my super user here, what we're going to see is that there are lots and lots of clusters that are in different resource groups, and lots of services that are in different resource groups. So there's lots of things going on here. that are in this account. Let's see. That are in this account. If it'll start showing it, come on. There we go. So there's lots of clusters, there's lots of services. You don't really need to worry about what they are. The main thing is that whereas my super user can see all kinds of stuff, my this user can only see the stuff that is in his resource group. So right now that is just one service. So now what I'm going to do is go back to the user again and the access groups that he's in. I'm going to take him back out of the admin group, and I'm going to add him back into the user group. So let's put him in there. So now he's a member of the user group. So let's go back here again. For fun, we'll refresh the list, and you'll see that the user can still see the cluster. He wasn't able to create the cluster, but now that it's being created, he can actually see it. Now for fun, let's go create a service. So I'm going to use App ID for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a really useful service for authenticating users that are making web calls into your account. But two, because it's a service that creates really quickly, and so that's really good for demos like this. We're using the region that's in Washington, D.C. We're going to choose a paid plan. We're going to name it AA. This is the name of our resource group. And then we'll call it App ID. And you'll notice that it goes in the resource group, and this is the only resource group that I can choose. Again, if I had enough permissions across all resource groups, then I could choose any resource group I wanted. But right now, this user can only has access to this resource group, and so this is the only one that he can choose. So then what we're going to do again is we're going to go say create. And what we're going to see is that this fails because I don't have the permissions to do that. Again, keep in mind, this guy is in the user group, and the user group does not have access to create services like App ID. So again, this time I'll leave him in because it actually doesn't matter if he's in both groups or not. So this time he's already in the user group. I'll add him to the admin group. So user doesn't really help them a whole lot here because the admin can do everything a user can do. So we'll leave them in both groups. But the main point is now I've made him an admin. Going back to this screen again, I haven't changed anything. Before he wasn't able to create an instance. And what we'll find is that now he can create an instance. So here it is creating the service. And it takes a few seconds to do that. But then you get this overview page for the new service instance. So this is the service instance that we created. I want to go look at it in the resource list. So going back to here, what we're going to find is that the user can see the cluster that is still getting created and can see the service that got created. So what's really important here is that you saw that when the user tries to create a cluster or a service, they can't do it. But when the administrator tries to create a cluster or a service the exact same way, they can do it. That's because administrators are allowed to do this stuff and users are not. One more thing I'll show you just for fun is we'll take him back out of the admin group. So now he's just a user again. And we'll go to this existing service and we'll say, hey, let's delete that service instance. Users aren't supposed to be able to do this. So let's see what happens. And it says, yep, you do not have the required permissions. So that's good. This way, the users can't mess with the environment too much. The same thing happens here with the cluster. It's kind of interesting to delete a cluster while it's still creating, but nevertheless, you can do that. So here we're going to try, and here we're going to fail. So when we try, what's going to happen is, you don't even get an error. It just simply will not let you that this cluster still exists. So this is showing again that administrators can change around what's in the environment, users cannot. But either way, both the administrators and the users, they can only see the stuff that is in their resource group. They can't see the stuff that's in other users' resource groups. And so with that, we have completed this whole process where what we've done is, in fact, I'll show this picture here. Again, the first thing that we did was we created this account manager group for IAM admins. And then as that user, I used it to set up the access groups for, to set up a resource group that we called IAM demo, and then to set up 2 access groups for administrators and users. And then I showed you how the administrators and the users work. So it's just that simple. It's just that beautiful. Please take advantage of this, and I hope that you'll find it very helpful. Thank you very much.